Okay. So, absent either of the co-chairs, I can introduce our agenda for the day. So here's our agenda. We're going to start with the ADU ordinance. Just a quick refresher. It's something that the group is looking to potentially utilize in a more flexible way to further the affordable housing. So we have Erin King here, our Director of Planning, to give us a presentation on some of the background, some potential uses, and then open it up for discussion. So feel free to take it away, Erin.
All right. Well, good morning, and thanks for the invite to spend some time with you today. Bear with me while I pull my presentation up here, and let's hope I can get this up for you guys. Let's see. Okay. Can everybody see that slide in front of you okay and hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Well, we'll just dive right in. Don't know why it won't advance. That was a little curveball there.
I'm wondering.
Okay, there we go. I got it.
Okay.
All right. So just to get started and to kind of start from square one to make sure everybody's kind of up to speed on what we're talking about. In terms of accessory dwelling units, at a very sort of simple term, these are just a small dwelling unit that's on the same lot as the main house. And you can see a couple examples there on the right-hand side of this slide. They can either be attached, as you kind of see to a degree there on the bottom, or detached on the top. And they're generally subordinate to the principal structure. They're generally smaller in size, square footage to the main house. They're generally located behind the main house. And you've probably heard these referred to in some other terms as garage apartments or granny flats or backyard cottages. Those are some of the more mainstream terms for accessory dwelling units. One of the reasons I suspect why we're talking about it this morning is because there are some benefits of accessory dwelling units. There's a lot of those, and one of them is increasing housing choice and providing missing middle housing. We've kind of talked about that before. That's your housing that really falls on the spectrum in between single family dwellings and your more traditional multifamily buildings, things like duplexes and triplexes, accessory dwelling units, cottage courts, things of that nature. So it fits into that missing middle housing genre that's really getting a lot of attention, nationwide right now. Allowing citizens to age in place is another thing that accessory dwellings provide for folks who want to stay in their community as they age. That maybe they don't need the 2,000 square foot house they're currently in, but they like the neighborhood. Accessory dwelling units give folks that ability to age in place. It allows an opportunity to increase for general density. That's also a good thing to help support transit. It does create affordable housing options for community members. So again, if you're thinking of a neighborhood where maybe rent prices or home prices are on the higher end, having a smaller unit in the same area that could be rented at a lower, more affordable rate is a benefit. For homeowners, it's a way to provide additional income. If you're living in the principal structure, certainly you could have an accessory dwelling unit in your backyard that you could rent out, provide an additional form of income coming in. And then another good benefit of accessory dwelling units is it utilizes existing infrastructure to combat sprawl. And in our shop, in the planning department, we talk about sprawl a lot and the harmful effects of that. The good thing about accessory dwelling units is they're going to be located in areas where infrastructure already exists. So water and sewer already have to be in place to serve the main house. You generally are going to have your other support structures in place, your parks, schools, services, things of that nature. So those are already in place, and accessory dwelling units just kind of piggyback on that. So for us, in planning, Legacy 2030 is our comprehensive plan for Winston-Salem and Forsyth County, and we do talk about accessory dwelling units in Legacy 2030. And I just threw a couple of those recommendations in here, and I'll kind of run through these, but to make particular note, Legacy notes that allowing residential accessory structures as carriage houses and granny flats is being used by many cities. And what I would say, since Legacy was adopted probably over 10 years ago, that number has increased, and accessory dwelling units have become even more of a tool than was even thought about when Legacy was being crafted. And such a strategy employed in Winston-Salem's urban neighborhoods could create a significant number of new homes. And the idea there is that you wouldn't be overburdening one neighborhood, that you could kind of spread the growth demands around through, again, the general density concept through accessory dwellings. Legacy also encourages the use of accessory dwelling units in appropriate locations, and also recommends allowing detached accessory units or granny flats in designated zoning districts in our growth management areas 2 and 3. So if you think about growth management area 2, that's generally our urban neighborhoods built before 1950, kind of Silas Creek Parkway, a border on the west, kind of wrapping around those more traditional urban neighborhoods. And in growth management area 3, that's our suburban neighborhoods growth management area. That's what a large portion of the city of Winston-Salem is located in, a good chunk of it, and primarily zoned RS9. But it does recommend allowing those units in those growth management areas. Moving and kind of looking at accessory dwelling units in Winston-Salem, that they have been around in the city for a long time. And the way our zoning ordinance was written is you basically, if you're going to have an accessory dwelling unit, you could have one in your backyard, but there were occupancy requirements. The accessory dwelling unit had to either be occupied by a blood relative or a caretaker. And they were allowed with staff approval if they were attached or in the same structure. You basically just would come in and get a permit for those. If they were detached, you would have to go through our Board of Adjustment for a special use permit, which was not an overly cumbersome process, but it was a little more work than just coming and pulling the permit. Along the way, around 2016, there was a court case in Wilmington that really negated that occupancy requirement. And it basically said, if you're going to have these, you can't dictate who lives in them. And so we had to go down the process of amending our ordinance here in Winston-Salem because of that court case in Wilmington. And so we had proposed basically to just to get rid of those occupancy requirements. And there was a lot of public debate that went on amongst neighborhood advocates, planning board staff, city council. And at the end of it, in September 2017, city council adopted revised standards for accessory dwelling units. And the long and the short of it is the occupancy type was eliminated. But what came out of it is there were basically any new accessory dwelling units had to be approved by a special use district rezoning process. So that is far more cumbersome than just going to the Board of Adjustment to get a special use permit, and even more so cumbersome than just walking into the permit office. It's a much more extensive process, and I just noted there the fee, that previous fee to go to the Board of Adjustment under the old rules was $100. Even for the smallest site now to come in through this process, you're looking at a $1,000 submittal fee that's payable just to the city to begin the rezoning process. And then you're going to have a professionally drawn site plan, which is probably going to cost you 2 or 3 times that fee at a minimum just to get permission to construct that accessory dwelling unit. So what has happened since September of 2017 is that we have had no new accessory dwelling units built in the city limits since that time period. And I note in here most likely due to the challenge posed by that special use zoning requirement. And I can say that fairly confidently as we've dealt with folks who have come in and inquired about this. There's certainly a desire to have the units there. But as we've explained the process to folks, they quickly become disinterested in going through all the hoops and hurdles to go through that rezoning process just for an accessory dwelling unit. So again, once the process changed in 2017, it pretty much ended accessory dwelling units in Winston-Salem. A little bit more recent trends, as I kind of mentioned to you, things I noted the reference in legacy, but there's starting to continue to be more discussion and more interest in accessory dwelling units. You have many national organizations, such as the National Association of Home Builders, that have really began to look at accessory dwelling units and think about how they relate to increasing affordability and adding some variety to the local housing supply. And you can see one of the publications there on the right-hand side of this image that the home builders have published. And the National League of Cities has also published a pretty extensive document on this as well. We've seen lots of discussions about accessory dwelling units at housing and planning conferences being best practices for affordable housing. And the publication I kind of noted here on the right-hand side recommends allowing ADUs as part of a robust housing strategy. And we'll kind of circle back to that sort of the idea of a housing strategy as we kind of conclude the presentation here shortly. Again, a little bit more on the recent trend kind of side of things. With these benefits of ADUs in mind, some states have passed statewide legislation allowing ADUs. California, New Hampshire, and Oregon. I think Oregon is for cities over 10,000 population or larger, so it's not a blanket, but it does allow it in those cities that meet that criteria. Some cities, I think California is an example here, have eliminated on-site parking requirements for ADUs if there's sufficient on-street parking available to try to help make these a more viable solution. And some cities have even allowed multiple ADUs on a single lot, one detached and one attached and one detached per lot, or one ADU and one junior ADU. So folks have gotten pretty creative with the way they've looked at these as a strategy to tackle the affordable housing issue. And then kind of scaling back to North Carolina, just a little quick benchmarking. Both Asheville and Charlotte have allowed these as a use by right to single family homes. So again, the idea there is you simply are able to go into the permit office and pull a permit, and assuming you meet any kind of other performance standards, you're able to get that permit and start construction. Raleigh allows accessory dwelling units, but only within an overlay district that must be established through a rezoning process. Their process is not very accommodating to accessory dwelling units. And then Durham has probably been the most progressive city in North Carolina. They've been really spending a lot of time on their expanding housing choices initiative. And as part of that, Durham had previously allowed ADUs by right on single family lots. The city now allows ADUs by right on duplex lots as well. And then also certain civic uses, so think churches there are allowed to have up to 3 ADUs per lot. And if you think about churches, lots of times churches have some additional land that's left over that's maybe not being utilized. So this gives churches and civic institutions the ability to have accessory dwelling units and make better use of some of that excess land that's otherwise not being utilized. And so I've just got some final thoughts for you here to kind of wrap up the discussion this morning. I know the focus of this coalition is on affordable housing. And I think one of the key things, and I'm sure you guys have arrived at this or discussed it, but there's no magic solution to solving this affordable housing crisis. And I think, at least in our shop, when we've kind of talked about this, it's really putting as many tools in the toolbox as you can to kind of help with the issue. And so accessory dwelling units, missing middle housing, building up density along growth corridors, increasing housing supply, removing barriers to housing. All of those things are good tools to really help the cause with affordable housing. And certainly ADUs are a widely accepted and proven strategy. So I noted the housing assessment that you see there on the right-hand side, and it recommends broadening the utilization of ADUs as one of those strategies. So it's referenced in those materials as well. ADUs really, is one of those things that checks the boxes from a housing standpoint and a planning standpoint. Again, for all the reasons I just described on the housing front, it makes a lot of sense. On the planning standpoint, for a lot of the reasons I covered early on, for good, smart, general density, for locating units where their existing infrastructure is located, spreading the growth demands around. For all those reasons, ADUs make a lot of sense on both of those fronts. And I guess just the last kind of closing thought is, our current UDO requirements, and that's the ordinance that was passed in 2017 for ADUs, those that doesn't really line up with what Legacy is recommending. If you remember those recommendations, and obviously your housing study that you see there on the right, which really recommends using accessory dwelling units as a strategy. So we've kind of got our wires disconnected there a little bit. We've got two key publications that really strongly tout accessory dwelling units, but we, from a regulatory side, are not in a good place to connect those wires. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm glad to take this down and answer any questions or provide any clarification if anybody needs any.
Hey, Aaron, it's John. You had mentioned that you'd had some folks come in with ADU or potential ADU requests, and you said you also mentioned that there was some hesitation on their part. I mean, what do you think it was mostly because of the cost, or was it the complexity of the process?
Probably both. Again, $1,000. $1,000 is $1,000 is $1,000, right? That's nothing to sneeze at. And then when you have to go out and hire an engineer or surveyor to draw this site plan up, you may be up to $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, and that's $4,000 without knowing you're going to get what you're ultimately asking for. So that's a sunk cost, and there's a chance you may get denied, and you've just spent $4,000 on nothing. So whereas before, $100, I think folks were certainly more willing to dip their toe in the water for $100 versus $1,000. And so, yeah, I think cost is absolutely a hurdle and a barrier. And I think the process, as well is a little bit outsized for really what we're talking about here. When you think of rezoning a piece of property, it's a little bit unlike any other sort of government function or government outreach in that we go to significant lengths to make sure everybody is aware. We post a sign in the yard to make sure anybody going by can see it. We send letters to every property owner within 500 feet. We advertise in the journal. We advertise on the city's website. We have an ordinance requirement that requires the developer to have neighborhood outreach with folks in the area. Then we hold a planning board public hearing and invite everybody down. And then there's an elected body public hearing. So the amount of touch points and the amount of outreach and all of those things are make a lot of sense when you're changing the zoning of a property. If you think about your home and maybe a convenience store or retail use going in across from you or beside you, there's a good reason to have all of those protections in place. But for somebody to simply put an accessory dwelling unit in the backyard of their already single family property, that's a lot of process for that very minor land use change. And so I do think both cost and process are hurdles that folks they just don't want to deal with and they don't want to go through.
Thanks.
Aaron,
I appreciate that.
Aaron, I have a question. What about existing structures that people may have in their back of their housing? What are the challenges with readapting use?
So I'm assuming, Paula, your examples, maybe let's just say if you have an existing garage in the backyard or existing accessory building and somebody wanted to convert that into a dwelling. So all of the challenges I just outlined for you are going to be there. The $1,000 submittal fee, the site plan, all of those costs are going to be there in that whole process that I just outlined. So that's sort of one piece of it. And then the second piece is really more on the building code side. And it's basically just making sure that whatever modifications to the interior of that structure meet North Carolina State Building Code. And that's a fairly cut and dry process. That the building code is set at the state level, and that's the same across the state of North Carolina. So that's not a huge hurdle. Really, the larger hurdle is the discretionary rezoning piece of it.
Aaron, let me toss out one other thing that I remember from shortly before I retired. We actually had and you probably remember this better than me, is we had someone who actually applied for a rezoning for an accessory dwelling unit and went to the trouble of submitting a site plan and all that. But before they got too far into it, they realized that because the site plan governs any changes from that point on the site, and the homeowner realized that that meant, let's say 5-10 years down the road, they wanted to do an expansion of their own main house, they would have to go back through the rezoning process all over again to amend the site plan and go through the public rezoning process just to expand their home. And that the person just threw up their hands and said, look, I'm not going to subject myself to all of these restrictions on my property, even my own main house. So they ended up withdrawing the zoning case.
Yeah, so Paul's exactly right. That there we had a lot up off Woods Road, which is kind of near Old Town Road up in the northern portion of the city. And Paul's 100% right. That person submitted their rezoning application. They paid the $1,000. They paid a surveyor to draw up the site plan. And then they did realize exactly what Paul mentioned. And our special use district zoning, for those of you that may not be familiar, basically what that means is you choose a zoning district, you choose which land uses you want, and you have a site plan that describes and shows exactly how the property will be used. And if that's approved by city council, that's what you are held to. And if you want to deviate or change from that, then you have to go back to city council again and go through the same $1,000, same process. So what that person realized is, yeah, if their family expands, they want to add on to the house, if they want to add a garage, if they want to, put a pool in or something like that, they're going to be going back to city council for that. And they just did not want to have to go through that process for any changes they made on their property. So that's a good point. That's an additional encumbrance that's there that's problematic.
The other thing I'll add about accessory dwellings is that, as opposed to many of the other forms of affordable housing that we're talking about, most of which would, if not all of which, would require some form of public subsidy, whether it's going through federal grants or it's going through the state housing finance agency or maybe some kind of tax credits or whatever. Accessory dwellings, there is no public subsidy involved in that whatsoever. It's totally done by the homeowner, and the costs are borne by the homeowner. So that's a way of expanding the supply of affordable housing without having to put any public money in it.
So a question perhaps that, if the group is interested in moving this forward, that I would encourage perhaps asking Aaron for some clarity on is, if the coalition members decide that this is something that you want to continue to pursue, you may want to think about what format that looks like and how you may do that. So I'm not sure if any of you have questions while we have Aaron on the line, but just to kind of get your wheels spinning in that regard.
Hey, Aaron, this is Representative Montgomery. How you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, sir. How are you?
I am doing well, and to the rest of the group, I apologize a little tired. We were in session until 3 a.m. this morning. So, Aaron, if I remember correctly, and Paul, you may as well, that there was supposed to be a follow-up when that was passed in terms of that will come back and reassess whether or not this policy was actually making any kind of difference in terms of by moving forward with accessory dwelling units. That there would be something that will come back around to just to check to say, hey, are we seeing more accessory dwelling units being created? Are we seeing the same level? Has this done anything? Has that already happened? Has that report or presentation already happened?
Representative Montgomery, I don't remember it off the top of my head, and I'm glad to go back and check through sort of the notes in there. I know we did something similar for the entertainment district. When that was being discussed, council asked for a follow-up, and I think we waited a year. We brought a report back to council, and we described what activity had or hadn't taken place. So I know we did something like that for entertainment district. I can't remember a provision like that for accessory dwelling units, and Paul can certainly chime in if I missed anything there. And Representative Montgomery, I don't know how much you heard of the presentation, if you're able to see all that or not, but what I can say is we have had 0 accessory dwelling units built in the city of Winston-Salem since that time. But like I say, I'm glad to go back and check the minutes on that. And Paul, certainly, if you've got any additional insight, that'd be welcome as well.
Yeah, Representative Montgomery, I do remember that that was a request to report back, and I guess there was nothing new to report. I guess the report, if it were to be given now, it'd be a pretty short report, given that there's been absolutely nothing that's happened since the ordinance was changed in the way that it was.
And the reason I bring that up is that I think that I did get all of the presentation, but at the end of the day, there were tons and tons of political dynamics that were at play at the time of the policy that was passed, that when it moved forward. And I think as well to make sure that the council members understand that if the intent was to create more units, that just isn't happening. And so that what was passed was too restrictive to be able to allow for such to happen. And so if that was still the intent of the council today, that it would need to look different in order to allow for the creation of those units to move forward.
I wonder if, given that, maybe the report from planning, which would again be very short, just reporting on what has happened since then, whether the timing of that could dovetail with any recommendations from the Affordable Housing Task Force. Because for anything different to happen with the UDO, it's going to take the direction of City Council to launch that, and maybe the combination of reports saying there's no activity along with the Affordable Housing Coalition's recommendations might be enough to give council something to chew on.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, Paul's 100% right on that. I think for us as staff, when council made that policy decision, then we have to implement the policy. And for us to have any, future discussion or to bring that topic back up, we would need direction from either the planning board, the city manager's office, or the city council to direct staff to revisit that policy decision. So it would take one of those three, I would think.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Aaron while we have his attention? Aaron, did I miss when that report is due to council?
That we can whip that up pretty quick. That is not a hard thing to do, and I think what we can do is we can craft that report, and we can get that to council, and then I think we can also supply a copy of that memo to the Affordable Housing Coalition, because that's where this conversation really began. But so we can absolutely loop the members of the Affordable Housing Coalition in on that memo.
Okay.
But I would again wonder whether it might be best for the whatever recommendations the Affordable Housing Coalition to be timed pretty closely with that report. Otherwise, the city council is just going to receive a fairly short report from planning that isn't going to say a lot other than nothing's been going on. So the policy question needs to be pushed, I think, by an outside group like the Affordable Housing Coalition, and that together with the planning report, I think would help in generating the discussion at City Council.
Well, yeah, I agree with you, Paul, 100%. So does it make sense then to maybe, do you think it makes sense to have two reports, or for it to just be something that is singularly attached to the recommendations from the council, from the commission, with the data and data points about what's happened, or two different kind of parallel things?
In my opinion, it's probably best for it to be two parallel, because the planning can only respond to the request of council of what has happened. And so separate and apart from that, but at the same time, hopefully Affordable Housing Coalition with its report could kind of help that.
And I'm glad to coordinate the timing of that, with Marla or however we need to. That's not an issue on our end.
Sounds like it's not going to take a lot of work to.
It will be a very quick report, Representative Montgomery.
Any other questions for Aaron? No? Okay. I'm going to go back to our agenda.
Thanks, Aaron. That was a great report.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for your time.
Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate you guys having me this morning.
Thanks, Aaron.
Okay. Do we have Tom on the line? Is he caller 3?
That is me. Don't I look beautiful?
You do. You do. Thank you for joining us. I know logistically you had some conflicts. Next on our agenda is an update on the employer-assisted housing pilot program. So basically, where are we at with regards to potential participating employer partners? And then, I think it would be beneficial if the group, wanted to start thinking about really a kind of a substantial format and administrative structure. What might it look like? Who might participate? Who might oversee and administer the program? Just a refresher, we do have funding set aside in the bond funding for this program. And we kind of just need to get something going. So, Tom, I think you and Donna were kind of spearheading that, but anyone can chime in, obviously.
Yeah, well, and I hate always getting into situations where there's an issue that comes up and kind of throws a big curve at what you're trying to do. But unfortunately, in this case, I think we have to admit to it. COVID is not helping because obviously the first two potential participants that I've been talking to are completely immersed in that right now. But as I ventured out in my thinking, and two of the clients that I do some business consulting with, it's just dawned on me that it's going to be difficult to get a lot of folks to focus on this in the immediate term. Maybe I'm wrong, and everybody please chime in, but I've got some clients that are just in survival mode right now, and that they have no focus except trying to get through the next day. So I'm kind of at a point where I need some guidance as to how we push this forward in this environment.
Thoughts from the group?
if I could weigh in, this is Marla. I'm wondering if we might want to have a conversation around how we frame the discussion on the need. I mean, I think everybody would have agreed pre-COVID that going down this path with a program would be a good thing. I think increasingly, when we think about not only the social determinants of health and how housing is one aspect of that, but even the fact that when we are looking at persons experiencing homelessness and how critical housing is even in that regard, um, I think it might be a situation of thinking about how to better or frame it differently, the conversation that we go forward with. Um, yeah, I think that might be the place to start, because I mean everybody everywhere is talking about the looming crisis, be it from evictions to other things. And when you even look at, for instance, in the healthcare field, a number of them have had layoffs, right? And so how are some of their personnel potentially in jeopardy of losing their homes, be it rental or ownership? So I think we probably just maybe need to take some time to expand how we talk about it and still help them to understand um, this is something that could still support their employees.
Now, Tom, I guess a question for you is the logistical issue that the folks that you simply had the attention of don't quite have the same attention span due to their shift in focus in response to COVID? Or is it that they just don't have necessarily an appetite for something of this nature at all right now? Or is it simply, maybe we need to just kind of shift the focus, as Marla said, but still try to maybe virtually get folks together? What do you think?
Well, I like what Marla said, because there are definite tsunamis in the horizon that a lot of these entities are going to be dealing with. It's just a matter of, my initial discussions dealt with, will you be willing to put a pile into, dollars into a pot and work with the city? Well, at this point, no one's really thinking about putting dollars into a pot for a future project. They're looking at trying to keep their dollars to survive and get through this crisis. So Marla's right. I think there's definite need out there with certain entities, but we just have to rephrase it. And I'm just looking for advice as to go back and say, okay, let's table this part of it, but here's some other elements maybe we can work on that help you in the immediate term, and we can work together on something like that. I think would make some sense. But no, definitely they're not willing to sit down with me and talk about the original concept, which I totally have bought into and believe in. But COVID has just unfortunately put that on the back burner.
Maybe one of the things to consider that we can do maybe in the next working group is maybe talk through creating some kind of, I hate to say survey, but some kind of questionnaire that really gets them to thinking about who it is that works for them and what, how they come to understand who their employees are and what some potential needs might be. So I think we might just want to start, with opening the door in a different fashion this time around. Because like you said, yeah, we've got trouble on the horizon, and they may not be thinking that far ahead. But we might be able to at least put something on their minds to get the conversation started and talk about how do we get out ahead of it, you know, before it really becomes more of a crisis than what we see ourselves dealing with from here today.
I agree 100% with that. And I think in this moment, all of our conversations have to be contextualized in light of the COVID crisis that we're in. Because the fact is that where we are right now has set back all work associated with housing, and it's going to be it will be multiple years worth of work to just get back to the places that I believe community, not just Winston-Salem, but communities were prior to COVID. So I think everything has to be just supposed in a COVID world. And what do things look like now, and how do we engage and move forward based upon where we are right now?
So I'll be happy to, you know, continue the conversation on that in our next work group, if that'll help. And I can, you know, try to think of some other things to bring to the table for the next conversation.
Anyone else have any thoughts on this before we move on? No? Okay, so the investor roundtable outreach. We have had quite a bit of discussion in general about trying to get a group of folks, again, obviously, in light of COVID, that changes as well quite substantially. So just curious kind of if any progress was made, you know, focusing on where we are today and the world that we are today, thoughts on this topic. Trying to see if Ryan is on. Ryan, I see that you are on but muted. I know that you had emailed me just a quick follow-up. Were you able to make any connections, or do you have any strong thoughts
There
on
we
this?
go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. I muted my phone and on the WebEx somehow. So I haven't had a chance to follow up with anybody, but just to kind of bring the group up to speed to the conversation you and I were having. You know, I think maybe this is in the work group. We need to have this discussion, but especially in light of the conversation we just had with folks' attentions being drawn in various different directions, maybe coming up with the initial ask or, you know, what we would like that roundtable to tackle early on would be helpful in getting folks' attention. I could see, seeing kind of two different tracks of dialogue occur there. One has been around kind of reestablishing what was the Funders Collaborative, which was really a grant-making entity. And then the other is, you know, maybe a larger endeavor looking at what some of the other cities have done around creating a fund like Charlotte has done, you know, an investment fund that would go out and provide some gap financing or something of that nature. I say that because I think when you start looking, especially at financial institutions where I can offer some insights, you're really talking about two different groups of people within the organization. And so trying to grab, you know, the appropriate person's attention will probably allow us to make better progress and not end up with kind of desperate groups at the table. So some folks from one and some folks from the other. I think generally speaking, the right people to target, if we want to have a conversation about both, are your CRA or community development officers. And, you know, we probably can track some of those down pretty easily. But if the group has a preference for where that conversation goes, then we should probably sort that out before we get too much further in building out a list. So that's my thoughts.
Great points. Thank you. Any other thoughts on that? Particular focus? Seeing some folks on mute. Are any of you?
I was talking and I thought I was unmuted. I'm glad you said something. I was saying I have a comment, but it's related to the investor roundtable, but it's more so, but it's a larger kind of perspective. It comes from our last conversation, and really in the sense of where we are right now. And I'd love to get feedback from the rest of the body because of where we are right now. I wonder if there is not an opportunity for us to really craft a shorter version of recommendations of that need to be acted upon more swiftly because of where we are in this moment. And particularly the short-term, medium, and long-term stuff, I think, and again, because of COVID, I think some of the things that we would have wanted to do in the past, more short-term, I'll probably shift it to medium-term. And then those long-term things, that list probably gets a little bit longer. But really looking at what are those short, medium, and long term. And then when we're talking about investor roundtables and folks who want to come to the table, you really end up giving them, what are we asking you to do? And that list really then breaks up. These are some emergency things, some immediate stuff that we feel because of where we are, we need to do. These are some things we were planning to do that were going to be more long term or medium term that have gotten pushed back. And really seeing how and where people's appetite is based upon the current crisis and the things that we had already been looking at of what we needed to do and how to bring and resource those items. Does that make any sense, or am I hadn't had enough coffee yet?
You're doing great.
That makes sense.
Again, 3 a.m. Making votes is not good to make policy at 3 a.m. in the morning. I just want to let everybody know.
I imagine not.
But it sounds like a strategy.
Yep.
Yeah,
For sure.
one thing that we've learned from COVID is the way we used to do things is not the way we can do them today and probably tomorrow.
Derwin, I think I remember the last meeting you pointed out as one of those items might be eviction.
Right, and I know that and I think Marlon mentioned too, just in the sense of the folks are just really looking at what's gonna. There's a big unknown right now in this moment of what's gonna happen in reference to evictions. Whether you're looking at the single family residential areas where folks have residential, or then maybe John can speak to just kind of what they see from an apartment complex standpoint. But even in that conversation, at least what I understood, that they're not seeing on the apartment side, and again, I'm not the expert there, they're not seeing as many, the people who were behind before are the people who are still have been lagging behind and struggling in that process, and not necessarily a lot of new folks coming into that arena. And I think the question then becomes resources in those areas, because I think we will see it, but I think it's still a big unknown, more so I think in those individuals who are likely in the single family residential rental market, because I'm not sure that we have as much data about what's happening there as opposed to having somebody like a John who can speak to what they're seeing in the apartment spaces.
Yeah, this is John. I would agree with that. I mean, The other factor on evictions is we're seeing a much more extensive problem at the lower income level than we are at the market rate level, which makes sense. But I hope you're right that we are going to see assistance soon. It's just the impact, the ripple effect of not dealing with the issue now could actually exacerbate our long-term problems pretty severely, because you could start seeing failure on the housing provider side. You can see, especially for the smaller rental operators, they could literally be facing bankruptcy, and that has an impact on everybody. So the rental assistance is probably, I totally agree with Representative Montgomery that the short term has become medium in a lot of ways, and medium to long term, but the keeping housing stable one way or another, and that's on the mortgage side too. There are homeowners who are going to be distressed as well. So doing whatever we can to keep housing stable is going to be probably the primary focus for, I would imagine, at least the next year.
Yeah.
And to that end, I think go ahead, Paul.
Well, I was just thinking, just listening to the news the last few days, I think there's more and more concern that because the recovery is not quite going as some may have expected, and that things were getting worse, that there's going to be a need to circle back to the HEROES Act that the House passed but the Senate hadn't taken up, because in July the extra unemployment benefits will run out. And so there's been some discussion about coming back to that, which has a lot of revenue sharing or a lot of funds heading to local and state governments. And, who knows what would eventually come out of that discussion. I know what it was in the HEROES Act had 11.2 billion that was targeted to local governments in North Carolina alone. And so things like rental assistance, if something like that came through and there were funds that came to local as well as state, issues like that, how to take advantage of that shot of federal funds that might come from that. It's going to be to our best advantage to have some recommendations that the council could act on pretty quick in the short run.
Paul, you hit actually exactly what I was getting ready to say in reference to additional resources, and again, going back to the need to why I think it's important to get some recommendations out ahead of that to make sure that folks are already thinking through and have some framework forward. But one of the things that I think is important to think about that is that, one, I'm not too certain about how much of the existing resources that did come down came directly to at least to Winston-Salem, that allows for some of that work. I do know that there are varying grants that are out there that are still moving. A lot of things that were targeted in areas where folks were housing insecure in the homeless areas, that resources came down, and even ability to look at prevention in some areas. But a large chunk of resources that did come to the state, in my opinion, got caught up in a lot of the political quagmire of things, and the advocacy at this point has been at the federal level, with, at least in some of the conversations I've been to put some language that when those dollars do come, that they have to go to some of these things that we're talking about, that the state gets, which there's some dialogue that North Carolina could be looking at somewhere around maybe $6 billion, which is more than they received in the last allocation under the CARES Act. That there's some very clear language around what and how those resources should be dispersed down to support and to do work. There was a great bill that I thought was working through HB 1200 that would have helped to have some additional resources to support some of the very things that we're talking about, but didn't move in the fashion that I think many of us would have wanted to. So I think some of that, and John, I don't know if there's any federal advocacy happening from the folks that you're associated with, but I know that there is from local municipalities to be able to get more direct resources that doesn't have to flow as they have been through the state.
Yeah, to answer that question directly, the National Apartment Association has been advocating directly for rental assistance, direct rental assistance, pretty much since the beginning of all this. And I agree on at the state level, HB 1200, we were actually lobbying aggressively for it. The president of our state association co-signed an op-ed with the Justice Center to advocate for it. So this is one of those issues where you have everybody in the housing sector is pushing for the same thing, because I think they recognize the peril that everybody's in. And it's very complicated when you look at the federal funding, because there are different avenues of funding, but the direct cares funding, Guilford County, because it met the threshold with 500,000 or more residents, received a direct allocation from the federal government. And I think the only other counties that did were Wake, Mecklenburg, and I think Durham got it as well. So there are only 3 or 4 counties, 3 or 4 local municipalities that receive the direct cares funding. Everybody else is going to come through the state. And as Representative Montgomery stated, that one of the issues there is that you have much less control over the flow of those funds. So every other municipality in North Carolina has been somewhat limited in what they can do compared to the larger cities and counties.
That's what interested me in the HEROES Act, if that does come back, and because what they were proposing was the local government share, the vast majority of the local government share would be allocated directly to cities on a CDBG-like formula. So that would, large cities over 50,000 population, of course, are entitlement cities under CDBG, and it would be a formula like CDBG that would allocate it directly to cities.
I agree with you, Paul. I think that would be preferable.
Yeah.
And I think the question for me then becomes, if with the resources, what the issues that are out there, like what would be recommendations of, okay, if that latter part happened, what should the city be allocating the resources to do? Should it be the eviction prevention work? Should it be a program similar to kind of what HB 1200 wanted to do for when it came to apartments, those things? I think that's the kind of thing to be able to give like some specifics to say, hey, these are some recommendations of get these resources. We think these things will have the impact to help negate some of the impact of what's going on in the housing arena.
Representative Montgomery, I think you're spot on. So there was a committee or a task force that was working together, and it was the Justice Center, some housing providers, and they helped craft what you see in the HB 1200 language and kind of how it would be applied, and some of the limitations on it, and how the funding would flow, who would disperse it in terms of rental assistance, even the AMI that it would cover. So we could take that and then use that as a starting point for what would work for Winston-Salem.
Yeah. Do you know how is Guilford received direct allocation? Think about 93 million. Do you know if they're doing, what are they doing around housing? Are they targeting housing with that, any of that?
Well, it's been a mixed bag. We actually did some direct outreach to the county commissioners to advocate for rental assistance. They have not done that yet. They've focused on the public health side of it. And they are also dealing with they've become much more involved in addressing homelessness than they have traditionally been. So it's a little complicated because, you know, it's interesting. They qualified for the 93 million because they have both High Point and Greensboro and those populations added to their count. But the money came to Guilford County. And so they haven't traditionally done a lot in the housing realm, and it's going to be interesting to see how involved they get in housing over time. But to this point, from what I can tell, they haven't done any direct housing support, but they have focused on public health and on homelessness.
So this might be a good time for a quick staff update, because it kind of is exactly what we're talking about as to where our current resources have been and where they're focused and kind of what we're still waiting on in order to be able to get some of the funds that we do have access to or will have access to out. So quick update, I'll give a very brief update and Marla and or Mellon can chime in with more details as needed. We were allocated some CDBG COVID funds directly from HUD. Some of those were already allocated along with the first round of ESG or the Emergency Solutions grant, which is homelessness focused. Those funds were already allocated out to agencies through a process, and we are simply awaiting our contracts from HUD for that. And those will be out the door, directed towards homelessness prevention and service providing. There is some CDBG funds in that are still unallocated. We are waiting for better direction from HUD as to how they can be utilized in light of the COVID allocation. There's a second round of ESG funding that will be coming to council for consideration for funding, as well as some state ESG funding. So anything that I mentioned that's ESG that is going to be focused around homelessness prevention, homelessness shelters, case management, and rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing type work. So under all of those fundings, it's limited to that. So we can't just do, you know, standard subsidized housing production just for the sake of housing production for folks who are not in a position of homelessness. We also have the community fund that was allocated out to agencies through the large community-wide RFP. My understanding those funds are out in the community. So from our team's perspective in community development, the funds that we have access to, we've allocated out or will be, and we are awaiting guidance and or contracts on some of it in order to get funding out and or allocated. Right now, a huge focus on homelessness because that's a lot of what came through the pipeline. There will be some small focus on prevention and such through the ESG funding to the extent that is allowable, both based on needs as well as statutory limitations on percentages of use towards certain types of funding. So as you all think about priorities, just know that those funds are out there or will be out there relatively soon, and in the community for those purposes. Again, Mellon, Marla, I can field any questions if you have any.
So April, it's John. Just out of curiosity, what do you have the numbers? Like what are we talking about in terms of the funds? And is there any idea of what the gap might be? What additional funds would be needed?
Mellon could probably cite the numbers a little better than I could. The first allocation of ESG, I want to say was 660,000. Of the CDBG, I want to say we got about 1.3, about 400,000 was allocated towards homelessness services and prevention. The remainder is still to be determined based on HUD's guidance as to acceptable uses. State ESG, I think, is partially allocated. Mellon, do you have the number off the top of your head?
I've got the numbers, April.
Okay.
660,000, 667.48 in ESG's first round. The award was 1.3830 in CDBG for the first round. Council in May allocated 299,250 in the CDBG to go with the 660 and the ESG funds. And so that was a total allocation in May of $959,998. And it's going towards rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, case management, rapid rehousing case management, shelter case management, diversion and prevention financial assistance funds, and then some diversion screening and diversion outreach. The money from the state is $712,000 that we will be going to council on July 6th to get the approval to execute all the necessary documents, both for us to receive the money from the state as well as then in turn us executing sub-agreements with organizations. And again, that amount is $712,943. So with the state money, it can be used for essential shelter operations and rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention. That particular pot of money had a minimum requirement of 60% that would go to housing stability. And so then the rest could be spread around prevention in other areas. And we're projecting using about, of that 60%, half towards emergency shelter operations and services and half towards rapid rehousing, and then the balance of the money for prevention. And then the $2,047,257 is the second round of CARES Act, and that will go before council on July 6th as well for the same authorization to execute the contracts both upstream and downstream. So in terms of gaps, I guess I'd like a little more clarity, maybe what you're thinking about, John, when you asked about, what potential gaps might be there. Certainly one of our biggest areas of emphasis is getting people into stable and permanent housing. So that's why you see, even with the state money, there's that 60% kind of carve out for housing stability. And even with the work that's going on right now with our medically fragile shelter, that was another of the conditions, was that when people went into that shelter, they had to be immediately assigned a housing case manager, so that hopefully when that shelter stands down, those folks would be moving into a permanent home rather than back into the shelter network. We do expect that there will probably be some people who might have to transition back into the network, but the various shelter staff and others are working pretty aggressively right now to get people into their own place. Been a number of applications that have been made around town for housing on their behalf, and deposits paid, and or application fees rather paid, and so forth. So they're going through the process of trying to get at least folks housed and minimize the number who have to go back into the shelter. So maybe you can help me understand more of what you're curious about in terms of gap.
Oh, you definitely address it. It really literally is it enough to in all those areas, is there enough funding to deal with the need? I think was my main question.
And
I know that's kind of a loaded question.
Well, and the reason I hesitate is because while we can get folks in, then down the road, will there be additional funding that comes annually to support everyone who's then been placed into the housing? I think we may have enough to get us started and potentially get a lot of people into housing stability. The question becomes, what resources will continue to flow from the federal level in year 2 and 3 and so forth, so that we can continue to pay or pay for the rent or have the vouchers or what have you. So that's the
Okay.
part that we're unclear of right now. But I think we might stand a good chance of having enough, which is why we've tried to focus a lot of this on getting people into the housing while still having a piece for prevention, so we can keep them from coming into the shelter network.
If I jump in just a little bit in there, in my opinion, I think that when you look at the programs that some of these are funding, like rapid rehousing, there were changes made to be able to extend, some of the timing that folks can receive assistance under rapid rehousing, which I think will be helpful. But historically, I have had a criticism of the rapid rehousing program because it is you tend to have individuals that may not totally be fully stabilized, and rapid rehousing funds fall off, and there's no backside resources to help continue to support that individual. Here locally in the community, I think that, and again, my critique will be that I'm not certain that we always manage the disbursement of that the right way. And that's not the city thing, that's another group's work. But the big piece is that when you have folks who get into permanent supportive housing, those ones that do have the longer term support that goes along with them, and we don't have enough permanent supportive housing or permanent supportive resources that are in that area. And so it's kind of like this interesting back and forth between those two programs when it comes to homeless population. But there are a ton of resources, and my hope is that when these resources come in, that not only are we helping to move folks more quickly, but then it enhances the system overall for a long-term improvement of how folks, particularly those who are in the homeless arena, are cared for, and strengthens the system to move people more quickly.
And I will say that the balance, the 1 million balance of the CDBG, we are looking to earmark for permanent supportive housing. Because that's the one where we can actually develop some units as opposed to the ESG. So our priority would be to utilize those CDBG funds for some permanent supportive housing units.
Any additional questions on COVID response and resources? No? Any additional questions or discussions for the group?
I had a couple of meetings ago, and it might have been, I might be thinking about our housing stock work group. We had talked about, at that time, we had actually talked about going to Durham and talking to the folks at Durham Community Land Trustees about how their program works and all that. Is there, would that be helpful if we tried to arrange a video meeting with somebody from there?
I'd be interested, Paul.
So will I.
Likewise. I think that's a good idea.
Okay. So would you like that to be for the housing stock working group, or?
I don't know, it probably depends on how much interest there is from the overall group. I know when we were in our housing stock group and we were talking about it, we thought that had the potential, depending on what we learn about how they've actually performed in Durham and all that, that might be a a good model for us to look at starting here. So probably just depends on the interest from the rest of the group beyond housing stock.
I'm always one that the more information you can glean, the better. So, yeah, whenever you can get it put together, let us know.
Yeah. I was just gonna add, not in relation to this piece that Paul mentioned, but as we continue to get information and kind of gather that, I do wonder, just in the sense of and I don't know, from the staff side, I think that what the council will meet once this in July and then won't meet again until August, if I'm not correct. Is that correct?
Yes, council will meet July 6th and then back onto the regular schedule in August.
Right, and I know that July time, and also is to try to help give staff, some time to take some time off and that kind of thing too. I just will want to say, like, for that August meeting, where there's a committee meeting from the council, if there's an ability for us to have something that we're sharing to the committee, just a shorthand of saying, hey, these are some things right now that we think we should be thinking about because of where we are right now, if that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm. And certainly if we would want to actually be on the agenda, whatever we would need to share to get into the packet, we'd have to have submitted by July 29th. That's our deadline for submission. Right, yeah, July 29th of items. So I mean, it's definitely doable. We just have to, decide what it is we want to take before them. And I'm imagining we will be going before the Community Development, Housing, and General Government Committee, which meets on the 11th of August.
Yeah, so I think, again, feedback from other folks, but I think that sounds, I like the way that sounds, and just the thoughts of what we've talked about here. Maybe if we surmise kind of the things we discussed here from last call about recommendations, and maybe get an email out and we kind of synthesize that on the specifics that we think we'd like to say, hey, ask the council to think about, and to keep top of mind, particularly as there's an expectation of additional federal resources coming down. At least what I hear right now, and again, all this can simply change, that we're likely looking at in August before there's some kind of congressional action on another something moving. So it could be very, very timely to make those suggestions.
Okay.
Would this be billed as kind of a interim report or status report from the Affordable Housing Coalition with some short-term recommendations?
COVID interrupted our deliberation report.
That would be fair.
Probably would be an interim report with recommendations. Recommendations.
And I would think at that point, the eviction prevention or rental assistance would be top of mind, because we're going to have, barring last minute action by the feds, we're going to have the end of the unemployment benefits on the 30th or at the end of July. pretty much in a lot of the federal assistance, not subsidies, assistance. And because the eviction moratorium is expired, the courts will have been able to process through quite a few evictions at that point. Or quite frankly, it'll be ramping up at that point. So I would imagine that we'd want those specific recommendations, like we talked about before, based on what the state came up with for HB 1200.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great starting point in that.
And I know somebody who was on that committee. I will try to get today we have the bill language. It's out there on the legislative website, but I'll try to get the committee's direct recommendations and get them to the group.
April, I have a question. I guess more of a couple of concerns. One, as it relates to the tourist neighborhoods, and just wondering, is there sufficient housing for relocation? I keep getting that question about the relocation.
No, there's not. I'll answer that for you, Paula. No, there's absolutely not.
Okay, and what is our the city's response to that, or the housing authority response?
I didn't hear your full question. What was that?
It was about tourist neighborhoods and the supply of housing for relocating families.
So the plan was a phased development plan where they would build a certain number of units first before anybody was relocated. And then they would relocate a group into the new housing and then just move people in phases and groups into the new housing as it's built, rather than relocating everybody off site and then trying to bring them back. So that's the way the plan is set up.
But don't they have a choice though, to go into the new unit?
Oh yeah, they always have a choice if they want to stay or if they want to go. And the way the housing units are set up, there will be 45 housing choice vouchers. So where the current configuration is 244 units of Cleveland Avenue homes. In terms of public housing units, there will physically be built 199 with 45 housing choice vouchers. And then the balance will be mixed income housing from tax credit up through market rate. So, but in the short term, nobody is being asked to relocate. Matter of fact, they will be getting a letter within the next probably 10 days or so, according to the HUD guidelines, that lets them know that the project is underway, but that they do not have to move. Matter of fact, that's something I'm proofing right now, so that the language stands out even more prominently about the fact that they don't have to move. Yes, they always have the choice, but they don't have to move at all if they don't want to.
Okay.
Hey, Marla, the only thing with that, is there just, I know part of that grant also is the resource and the people in the neighborhood and kind of how that works, but the folks get that letter. But at least from the data I've seen is that even though when you give folks that choice and they don't have to move, large number of folks still choose to take the voucher. And I'm just wondering how, if that duplicates itself, that again has that negative impact on numbers of housing stock in the community.
Well, right now the plan is only for 45 vouchers. So you got 244 units. So I'm not sure how the rest of the world works with the housing authority in terms of people just asking for vouchers because they want to move, but there are only 45 being made available as part of choice.
Okay, so they're only going to get 45 of them. Okay.
That's the way this is set up, is only for 45. Now, if you've got 60 people who decide they want to move, then I don't know how the housing authority manages vouchers in that regard for that difference in terms of the 45 to 60. But yes, this development only calls for 45 vouchers.
Interesting.
Right. I've got the phasing plan if
Mhm.
anybody wants to see it.
My other question, thanks for that, Marla. I
Mhm.
was wondering how we were dealing with that. My other question has to do with the, early on, we talked a little bit about the inclusionary housing policy. And I got the sense that that's something we really don't like to talk about. But I know in other cities, there is an opt-out fee that goes into a housing fund. And I know ours is voluntary. So I'm wondering, is that just where the policy is mandatory that you can do opt-out fee? Or, and then are we doing anything here to put more teeth in our local policies?
Well, I think Representative Montgomery can speak a little bit more to this than what I'm going to say, but that's definitely at the state legislative level. We don't have any mandatory. I think there's only one community that has been able to get a legislation on the books that allows them to do inclusionary zoning. But some time ago, the legislature, and yeah, Paul can speak to this too, the legislature was not willing to provide localities with that ability to enforce or utilize inclusionary zoning. Yeah, it's been optional, but Paul or Representative Montgomery might speak to it in more detail.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think Chapel Hill is the only place that has to do that, and they ruin it for everybody else in the state. But I think what has been the conversations here since the legislature has taken that ability from communities to really make that decision and choice, has been, well, if you don't have that ability as of now, what can you do that is incentivizing the development? And I think there you have the Paul. There's the within the zoning. I know there's some affordable. There's some benefits you get with it, but that's another area where you don't get people who take advantage of it. So.
Right. The UDO allows a density bonus, but nobody has taken advantage of that. And I think the same prohibition for mandatory inclusionary zoning also applies to the payment in lieu as well, because that would be a requirement for a developer to pay in lieu. So I think that is covered under that prohibition currently from the General Assembly.
All right. Well, thank you for that. That comes up a lot too.
Yeah. I think what Representative Montgomery was referring to, though, is that the city using its financing abilities to leverage the agreement by developers to allocate a certain share of their housing projects to affordable units. But that is only able through the provision of city funding in helping the finance.
Okay.
Great questions, Paula. Thank you. Okay, so just to recap a few things, what I think I'm hearing is we would like an entire group to potentially have a video discussion with Durham to discuss their community land trust structure to see if it might be something that could be implemented here. Prior to the working group, the group would like to put together some sort of a kind of COVID interrupted memo to the council for consideration at the August 11th Community Development and Housing General Government Committee meeting. The deadline for submission is no later than July 29th. Marla, I would assume we'd like to have it a little sooner than that to give us time to prepare our things and get it into the system. Is that correct? Would that be accurate? Marla?
Yes, I'm sorry, I was on mute.
That's okay. I should have looked at my calendar before I said that. Do you have a date in front of you that's a comfort level for you for that, Marla?
Uh,
So the
I might need to get back with you on that because I've got a couple of other things I'm trying to juggle.
Okay.
Yeah, that's to be determined.
Okay, so to be determined group, but we will follow up with you in an email on that. Representative Montgomery, are you going to be the person spearheading that memo?
Sure.
Thank you. And in the working groups, the focus on the pilot program will likely be reshifted and perhaps a refocused effort may be brought back to the group for the September meeting. Is there any consensus at this time how the group anticipates or desires to move forward with regards to the ADU? Or would you like to, did that originally come out of the long-term planning group or the housing stack group? Please remind me.
It was housing stock group.
Housing stock.
Yeah.
You discuss it in more detail and bring something forth to the big group in September.
You know, I have that write-up that I sent
Mhm.
that I think was distributed out. So
Yes.
maybe that could be that could be something that is discussed or amended or whatever the group would like.
I think I'm supportive of anything that the group wants to do on it. I do think it needs to be adjusted. Having been someone who was at the table when it was approved, it is extremely imperfect, and it was an attempt to move along a process that had gotten stalled for some time, and again, it has not been effective.
Would it be helpful if I sent out Paul's kind of draft at information now that this is fresh in everyone's mind and kind of allow people to think about it again?
Maybe April, if you could send that memo out to everybody again and they could just
Sure.
take a look, see if they think about it. Does it need to be strengthened? Is it okay as it is? You know.
I can do that. And then Representative Montgomery will work on the memo to the council committee. The working group the access working group will work on the pilot program refocus. Is that correct?
Say that again, April?
For the pilot program, I would imagine that the working group will probably want to focus heavily on the shift in focus and the ask and all of that at the working group meeting.
Yeah, and actually, Marla, I might try and set up a phone call with you because you brought up some points today that I'd like to follow up on and talk to you about. So look out for an email to get on your schedule.
Okay. Do we have anything else? I have a lot of folks on mute, so is there anything else that you have questions or concerns on or items that you'd like staff to follow up on or that you'd like to be included on the working group agendas for August that you can think of now?
Nothing else for me.
Okay.
Either.
Oh,
Everyone's good?
yep.
Okay, so we got a lot of work to do between now and August.
The good news is we have nowhere to go, so, hey.
July.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Nothing to do but work, right? Okay, well, I will follow up with some recaps, with some meeting notes, some follow-up items, and a date deadline to make sure that staff has some time to do our preparation in advance of that July 29th deadline for the August committee meeting.
Okay,
Okay,
Very
thank
good.
you.
Right?
I
Thanks.
appreciate it. I'm glad this worked out for everyone. If you have any technology questions or needs, feel free to send me an email and I'll be happy to address them ahead of the next meeting.
Thank you,
Thank
April.
you,
Thanks.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
All right,
You
bye-bye.
too.
everybody. Hey.
Bye.